Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from Enfield Voices in Global Net 21, and this is one of the regular webinars that we do where we look at major issues that are facing us locally and nationally and even globally. And today we're going to look at climate change, but we're going to look at it in a particular way. We're going to look at it from a local authority point of view, because right across the country, in fact globally, many local authorities, city authorities, are beginning to declare a climate change emergency. Now, Enfield hasn't done that, and it's delayed doing that. And we're going to look at why that's important, why we think that's happened, why the delay we think might have been the reasons behind it, and discuss that generally. Today, we've got two people with us. We've got David Flint, who's been an activist for a long time in the Green movement and a member of the Green Party. He'd kill me if I don't tell you that. And we've got Elaine Graham Leigh, who's also been active locally for a long time, and she's been one of the founding members of Extinction Rebellion. And I'm really pleased that we've got you both with us today. So if I could start by asking them, I'll ask you, David, first, because you've been around longer than us. Well, you haven't been around longer than me, but you've been around for a long time. I mean, you're both involved in the challenge of climate change. I mean, what personally has brought you to the point where you thought action is necessary at a local level like this? David.
Well, for me, Francis, it was a retirement project. I stopped being a management consultant a number of years ago and thought, what am I going to do with all my spare time in retirement? Well, that was a bit silly, wasn't it? But I decided that I ought to look at an important issue. Climate change was the obvious important issue. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that it couldn't be handled by pressure group politics. It needed a fundamental change in society. Hence, it needed me to be in a political party. So I joined the Green Party.
Okay, and Elaine, I know you've been active for a long time, and what's made you look at climate change as the one thing now that you'd love to concentrate on?
Well, climate change was really how I got into politics. My personal sort of waking up to it, if you like, was sitting one perfect afternoon in the pub garden in the Spaniards about 20 years ago, looking round and suddenly having a kind of a road to Damascus realization that all this could be under threat from climate change. But I think really, I mean, in a sense, I follow sort of Naomi Klein's dictum in the way where she points out that the climate change is kind of an inciting issue. It makes everything else that we face just so much more serious and so much more urgent. So to me, it's one of the many reasons why we need to change the system, and it highlights why we need to do it now. So I think that's why I've remained a climate change activist along with everything else I do.
Okay, and I know you do many other things as well. Now, in Enfield, Councillor Vicky Pint has been trying for a long time now to try and get a motion in the council to declare a climate change emergency. And I think she's worked with a number of people, including you, David, on this. And, you know, what is your view about that motion, and how important do you think it is, David?
Oh, I think it's very important. I mean, if you think about the general case of dealing with an emergency, you have a flood, you have a fire, what's the first thing you do? The first thing you do is give the alarm in very clear terms. And the motion serves to give the alarm in the particular case of Enfield Council. Now, following on from that, you have to have action, you have to safeguard people, you have to decide what to do to deal with the problem. But giving the alarm is the first step. And the climate change motion can do that and can mandate the steps that are to follow. A good motion will mandate the right steps. It'll mandate community involvement. It'll mandate effective action. Vicky's motion would do that. Whether that's what gets through to council, we shall see.
Okay, but you know, Elaine, some people would say, why are we doing this at a local authority? Mainly, this is a national or global, problem. Why are local authorities getting mixed up in all of this?
Well sorry.
I mean, that's true, that a lot of what needs to be done is something that really national government can do rather than local authorities. But I think councils have a huge role here in just declaring that, okay, we recognise that business as usual is not going to cut it. We have to make a dramatic departure from what we've been doing now. And really councils can put pressure on government. in that sense. I mean, it's a bit like, councils declaring themselves nuclear-free zones in the 80s. That wasn't obviously a concrete thing, but it did put real pressure on the government, and it was an important part of the anti-nuclear movement. So I see Enfield declaring a climate emergency, if they would do it, as well as being about concrete things that Enfield would do, would actually be yet another council saying to the Tory government, you've got to step up.
But David, it's not just about political pressure in that way, is it? I mean, a climate change emergency has some real, substance to it. I mean, what does a climate emergency mean as far as local authorities are concerned? Is it just a sort of, trumpet sound, or does it mean you have to take action?
Well, Francis, I think we both know that for a good many local authorities and a good many councillors, it will just be a piece of greenwash. And that's the trap. But it doesn't have to be a piece of greenwash. What it can be is a real call to action. Now, the reason local authorities should be involved is twofold. Partly because everyone has to be involved. This isn't a problem we can solve without the participation of all parties, all sections, and therefore local authorities must play their part. But the other reason for local authorities is that just because the scale of the problem is so large, the need for national and international initiative is so great, we need to link that to the people, and local authorities should provide a channel for involving people locally, so that locally people understand why it is so important that we do all the things that are needed, some of which are going to be uncomfortable.
Okay, but Vicky has tried to get a motion into Enfield Council twice now, and there's been delay, there's been procrastination. Do either of you have any view of why this has happened? Elaine, let's start with you.
Well, I'm not privy to the internal machinations of Enfield Council, so I can't really say specifically why it's happened. I can only say that it's incredibly disappointing that it's happened, and I think we have to start holding the council to account on this. I think one reason why it's happened is that they think probably that it is just a piece of greenwashing, and the people of Enfield don't really care. I think if we actually do care, we have to not let them get away with failing to debate this now for a third time.
David, do you have a view on this?
I have to be careful what I say here, but what I would say is that if you want to understand why the motion hasn't got prominence, you have to look at the internal politics of Enfield Labour Party. And I'm not a member of Enfield Labour Party, so I think I regard this as a private fight that they must just get on with.
So you think that maybe the situation in the Labour group where they're divided between each other and they don't want to acknowledge what the other side has done may have played a role in this?
You may very well say that. I couldn't really comment.
David, that's the first time I've heard you diplomatic, so congratulations. Anyhow, I mean, they haven't, we don't know whether they will debate it. It's unlikely they will debate it, but they have produced a report, and which the officers have put together very, very quickly, indicating that, more should be done than what they've done already, but not having some of the things in that you've talked about, David and Elaine, about community involvement and so on. I mean, do you think that report's enough, or does it need to go further? Do you need to have the motion first and then a report after that really looks at a strategy on a climate change, not climate change, but climate change emergency?
Look, in a sense, it doesn't matter what order we do the things in, providing we do the things. Any report will only be able to address some of the things. The issue is to get started. Now, this report is a weak report, but it does have some things that are important. And I pick out one in particular, where it says that Enfield Council should aim to be carbon neutral by 2030. Now, 2030 is a demanding target. It's a target that the council is currently on track to miss by a mile. So immediately you can see from the report itself that there is a gap between what they're likely to achieve and what they now say that they want to achieve. So that immediately gives us leverage. The report is a scratch job put together in a hurry. Something better can follow it, providing that the motion is passed, providing that the cabinet takes it seriously, providing that the rest of us outside the council and the Labour Party hold them to account on what they're now about to say, if they do say it. Let's hope they do.
Okay, I mean, like, holding them to account is important. Scrutiny is important to make sure that, the behaviour of the council and all their policies fits in with the climate change imperative. I mean, how do you think we can make sure there is that adequate scrutiny so that they're not just blowing in the wind, you know, a future that they think they're doing when they're actually not?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that can often be quite difficult when you're faced with councils who aren't necessarily open with what they're really doing. And this is where I think groups like Extinction Rebellion is very important, that we are able to keep up the pressure on them and keep on demanding that they account to us for what they're doing. I mean, I have to say, I haven't had the chance to read the report yet, which David obviously has. From what I've heard about it, it doesn't sound like anywhere near good enough. I mean, I think a weak report is putting it mildly from the sound of it. And it is the very definition of business as usual. And the whole point is that business as usual won't cut it. You know, we're not saying that no one has done anything about climate change. But if we carry on at the rate that we're going now, it will be entirely insufficient. And the idea that sort of internal machinations of the Labour group is actually going to prevent us from saving the planet is, well, it would be risible if it wasn't tragic. So I think our holding the council to account has to start here and say we will not be put off just by this report blowing their own trumpet.
So if it's inadequate or they don't fulfil their obligations, I mean, what do you think you will do through Extinction Rebellion, Elaine?
Well, I think through Extinction Rebellion, what we can do, we can protest, we can disrupt, and Extinction Rebellion is very much about recognising that we don't just politely say, well, we don't approve of you. We say, right, we are going to make your lives difficult unless you start actually stepping up. I'm sure there are lots of us now active in Extinction Rebellion Enfield. People will have lots and lots of creative ideas of what we can do to hold the council to account. But if they think that we're going to be put off, put aside by this report, they've got nothing coming.
And David, I mean, being in another political party, I'm sure you would remind the council that there's been an opinion poll really recently that said 71% of people in this country would change the party they vote for on the issue of climate change.
Well, that's certainly a point we would make to the council and to the Labour Party with some force. In terms of holding them to account, we need to have annual targets so that we can track what's progress on an annual basis. A 10-year target is not meaningful in terms of scrutiny. So we need to push the council to concrete commitments with numbers, with dates, so that we can track going forward. This isn't, after all, something that's going to be resolved this year or next year. This is something that's going to play out over at least a decade. We have to be in for that length of time at minimum. And we're going to have to keep up the pressure. And that pressure can come from political parties, and it can come from Extinction Rebellion, which has made a real difference to the way in which everyone debates the issue. And I pay tribute to what they've done here. But there is scope for lots of approaches here. And together, we ought to be able to push the council and other councils, this isn't just them, into effective action. But it's going to be work.
Okay, well, let's put you in the spot now and ask you that, you know, if you were on the council now and you had a chance to introduce the 3 most effective measures that you could get the council to follow to cut emissions, to get carbon neutrality by 2030, what would they be, Elaine?
Oh, 3 things. Well, I think first of all, I would look at where the council's money is invested, and I would divest from fossil fuels and all other polluting investments, and that would be a matter of urgency. I think the second thing would be around transport. Transport in the UK is actually the biggest producer of carbon emissions, and I would look at how to get the private cars and lorries off the roads. And obviously working with TfL and so on, I recognise this isn't all in the council's power, but I think there are lots of things that the council can do to boost public transport and get rid of cars as far as possible. And then the third thing I think would actually be looking around what we can do to reduce carbon in terms of, say, tree planting and things like that. I mean, there's not very much space to do large-scale rewilding in Enfield, but on the other hand, we do have quite a lot of open land that can be used, and that then is something that's very tangible. You know, if the council promises that they're going to plant trees, well, we can go and check. We can go and look at the trees, and that would be something I think that would actually be improving people's quality of life in Enfield as well, protecting and enhancing green spaces as well as helping the environment. So that would be a good sort of easy win that they could do really quite quickly.
Okay, I mean, we'll come to the de-investment in a minute, and James Hockney, who's a Conservative councillor, has asked about that. We'll come to that in a minute, because a lot of Conservative councillors would support the motion as well, not just Labour councillors on the council, and that's a really interesting fact. But David, what would be your three, issues that you would follow?
Well, they're related. My first would be divestment, obviously, which is both a prudential as well as a moral imperative. And then the other two would be transport. One is that low traffic neighbourhoods are a good way of shifting people out of their cars to active transport. That produces a reduction in road traffic, well proven in Waltham Forest. I'd want low traffic neighbourhoods rolled out right across the borough as a priority. I think that would both provide local benefits, more livable streets, and also reduce carbon emissions. And I'd add to that the council should electrify, first of all, its own fleet of vehicles, moving to battery electric. Secondly, it should put pressure on the operators of taxi and private hire services to move those vehicles to electric. And of course, it should be working with TfL to electrify the bus system. So all of that moves in the same direction.
And do you think anything more needs to be done? Because many people argue that we're at the tipping point, really, and we have to take even more, urgent action to change the lifestyles of people that live in our boroughs.
Well, I think a lot of things need to be done, but many of them are not in the competence of local authorities. To take an obvious example, we need to fly less. We need to eat less meat. I've been doing some work on farm policy on this recently, and it is workable, but it's a national matter. We need obviously to move from driving cars to cycling to walking. All that's very straightforward. We need to improve public transport. I mean, there is a long list of things that we need to do. The local authority. I'll give you one more. Local authorities ought to be spending a bigger fraction of the money that has to be spent than currently seems proper. Local authorities need to have more funding from government to get this done.
Okay, I mean, that issue about the investment that David raised and you raised, Elaine, there is a campaign in Enfield for de-investment, and lots of councils and lots of organisations and charities are beginning to de-invest. Enfield hasn't yet. I mean, why do you think they're resisting on this as well as a climate change emergency, Elaine? What's the problem here? What's the block?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, again, I'm speaking for them when I don't actually know what the reason is, but often I think there's a fear that you're giving up decent returns. And the excuse that you get when you talk to investment managers for organisations and so on, they'll say, well, yes, but we can make much more money if we carry on investing in fossil fuels than if we divest, and therefore we have a duty to our shareholders or to the local people or whatever to not do that. I mean, so this I suspect would be the argument, and the answer really is that actually it's not true. It isn't the case that you have to make a trade-off between environmental principles and returns. Actually, there are lots and lots of investment packages that you can do that actually you can make the money that you need to make. You can carry on making the return and actually not be invested in fossil fuels at the same time. So if that is the council's argument, it's a poor one. I don't think there's actually a case for not divesting.
I mean, to be fair on the council, I think they're in discussions with the de-invest campaign and pressure group, and hopefully something will come about that. But the report seems to put so many provisos in it that you're wondering how quickly they will move towards that, which makes you wonder how would you organise the council to deliver on these things, David? I mean, when you look at the report, that they said other departments should be involved, but they were footnotes at the end. Surely you need some sort of almost war cabinet. You need a cabinet figure in charge of it. You need someone to say that the imperative of climate change has to be embedded in every department. It's not just an offshoot that one committee deals with. I mean, would you reorganise things to make it really urgent in that way, David?
Oh, I've never run a local authority, Francis, so I'm just a bit hesitant about this. I have been a pension trustee, but let's move on from that. What I think I'd say is that the way in which the governance operates has to be something that works in the ways that the council works. And that might mean appointing a cabinet post to lead the climate change thing. Or it may be that we would be better with all the cabinet members taking this very seriously. The key, it seems to me, is that the way we do things at the moment has got to change, and that no policy which involves, tweaking a bit, no policy that follows the Tesco doctrine, every little helps, is acceptable. Because if everyone does just a little, all we will achieve is just a little, and that isn't going to do. So the fundamental has to be massive, significant change in the way every part of the council operates. That's going to be very challenging. And every cabinet every cabinet member at local authority level needs to recognise their part in making that change in their departments.
Yeah, I guess if you don't ensure they do that, people will think, oh, we've got a committee about it, we don't have to worry about it, so we can just leave it to them. And everyone has to be involved. Yeah. And Elaine, when we say everyone, we mean the community as well, don't we? I mean, as a council, if they think they can do it alone without involving civil society, they're going to fail, aren't they?
Well, yes, absolutely. And it has to not be something that's top down, where the council decides what they're going to do and then they inform us or not, as the case may be. It has to be two-way. So we have to be developing mechanisms where actually people can come together and we can say, well, this is what we want you as our council to do. And they are, after all, supposed to be our democratic representatives. It doesn't often feel like we have very much choice, but we do. And they have to be responsive to what people want, and not think that because they're the council they know better. So this is where, Extinction Rebellion obviously calling for citizens' assembly. There are different democratic models that we might want to use, but I think the fact that the community just don't appear, from what I hear in the report, is quite worrying, in the sense that they're really not taking on board any of the lessons of recent months.
Well, David, how would you involve the community? Elaine's mentioned citizens' assemblies, and some councils are beginning to do that. Scottish Parliament are beginning to think about that. That's ran into trouble. Some have looked at citizen juries, civil society forums, democratising the scrutiny committee so it involves the community as well. How would you bring the community into it so they're not just consulted and forgotten about, but they have a real input?
I think I'd go for the Citizens' Assembly. The experience in the Republic of Ireland with the citizens' assemblies for abortion and for climate change has been very positive. I think the power of the Citizens' Assembly is that it matches the democratic principle of bringing in ordinary members of the public with the fact that those people get to hear expert advice and testimony from people who've spent a lot of time studying it. Getting those two things to work together is absolutely critical. And what the evidence seems to show is that when that happens, the Citizens' Assembly will come to a more radical conclusion than elected politicians feel comfortable with, but which they can then rely on as providing them for a mandate of the things that need to be done. So I would go for that.
So that means, Elaine, that the council has got to be an enabling and a collaborative one, and can't have people there saying, we know everything, we're going to do it ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. They tend to behave, as many councils, many elected officials do, as if they're elected for their period and they don't have to listen to people in between. We have to have a model where actually they are continually accountable to us, and not just at election time.
By the way, I've just had another remark from James Hockley saying he's heard that there is a technology to run refuse vehicles on electric. Do we know if this is deliverable? That's something I'm sure you know the total answer to, David.
Francis, what trust you have in my expertise? I don't know specifically. I'm sure I would have thought that battery-powered vehicles were possible for that. Distances are short. Stop-start is a case where electric works quite well. Don't see why not. But failing that, we need to find another low-carbon solution. There are others.
But the whole idea of using electric vehicles and so on takes you to another point, and that is that, the reason for involving civil society is not for them to be consulted, but for them to understand that they have a role to play as well. That climate change is about corporate, national, local, but also personal change. Would you agree with that, Elaine?
To To an extent. I mean, I think the problem with discussions about green issues is that once we start talking about personal change, it can become tremendously moralistic. And I think we have to recognise that the choices that people make now are within the system as it exists now. And there's not very much point in hectoring people to make changes that within the current system aren't necessarily practical for them. But I do agree that everyone has to have ownership of the issue. We have to have a say of what alternative system, alternative world we're building. We can't just be expected to just be part of a focus group or whatever and then leave it up to the council, because that isn't going to work, and we're not going to end up with the better world that we can get as a result of the changes we have to make.
But David, you took a more moral point of view about there being a personal responsibility, didn't you?
Well, there is a moral dimension to this, because unless we do what is needed quickly, we are in effect depriving the future generations of resources to which they're entitled, of the biodiversity to which they're entitled. For me, that is indeed a moral question. But for me, a good deal of politics is morality projected into the public sphere. So I don't think that's only true for climate change. I think it's more broadly true. But I'm entirely with Elaine. There's a lot of the choices we made are made in the context of a high carbon infrastructure of electricity, which has far too much carbon involved in its production. That's not something we as individuals can do, but it is something that we as political animals in a political system can press on our government and our local authorities to do. And that is the moral responsibility, I believe, to be politically active and saying this has to change.
And Elaine, one question I have to ask you on this, that some people say, well, why are you concentrating on climate change when we've got so much poverty, we've got declining NHS and privatised NHS? Why aren't you prioritising those? Because that affects people's lives now. Why climate change?
Well, I think it's part of the same issue, really. I mean, I think the problems we face with the climate crisis are the creation of broadly capitalism, and specifically the neoliberal privatisation agenda, which similarly makes it very difficult to entertain the real solutions that are out there, which would inevitably involve nationalising power generation and transport and so on. So really, I think it's part of the same fight. I mean, at the moment, we've got a great moment where people are really talking about climate change, but I don't feel that when I'm campaigning on climate change, I'm not campaigning against austerity, that I'm not campaigning to defend the NHS, because it's all part of the same thing. I think, we know that we have to change the system, and this is just one of many, many reasons why we have to change the system.
Okay, well, we're coming very close to the end of this interview now. So, David, I mean, are you optimistic? Are you confident that things can change, not only globally, but here in Enfield as well?
No, Francis, I'm not. Confident is not a thing I think you can reasonably take, given that emissions globally are still rising, given the fact that the US is pulling out of Paris, given the opposition of Saudis and the US and Russia to the further debate of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees C. I think confidence in success would be folly. I'm hopeful, but I'm not confident. I think in order to get this done, even those of us who are committed are going to have to do more and more radical things than we've done so far. And that's just what it's going to take. But
Elaine, Extinction Rebellion is about optimism growing out of pessimism, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's true, and I think if you look at what's happened to the climate movement over the last year, I mean, who would have thought even this time last year that climate change would be the headline issue on everyone's lips, really? I mean, what's happened really, starting with the school climate strikes and then picked up by Extinction Rebellion, in terms of people caring about climate change, being on the streets about climate change. So it would have been unthinkable 12 months ago. And it just shows how people can get into motion really quickly, quite suddenly, and how things can change really quickly and suddenly. So, yeah, I agree with David in the sense that confidence isn't quite the right word. Hopefully militant, perhaps, is the way I would put it.
Okay, well, let me ask you the last question each, starting with you, David. I mean, if people wanted to get involved in this and join the campaign, do what they can to make a difference, I mean, how would they get involved locally and who would they contact?
Well, they could join the Green Party, they could join Extinction Rebellion, they could go and see their councillors as independents and say, independent citizens, say, I'm very concerned about this. And I'd say particularly to the people who are not on the left that there is a place for them in solving this problem. This is not a problem in which we can treat purely as a cause of the left. This is something where we need the Labour and Tories and Liberal Democrats and the politically unaffiliated to recognise that we are all vulnerable to the harm that climate change will do, and that we are all have a role in making sure that we don't get the damage done that is so obviously coming if we don't act effectively. It has to be as many people as possible, as broad a consensus as possible to get the changes made.
So it's we're all in it together, Elaine. It's not something that's a tribal view. Everyone is affected by this. So how does everyone from any political view get involved from your point of view?
Well, see, I agree it's not a tribal issue, but it is a political issue. I mean, you know, it's true that, oh, okay, it'll affect everyone, but on the other hand, the problem with capitalism is that you can go on making profits from environmental disasters. There's no mechanism within capitalism to force corporations to care about it. So Tories and Lib Dems and so on are very welcome to come. Tories are very welcome to come and demonstrate at the Tory party conference in September. They'd have to give up quite a lot of their current views to do so, but I think that's necessary because it is a political issue and we have to fight it politically.
Well, it's very interesting that the only councillor we've got on the webinar system today is a Tory one. It's very supportive of what you're doing. So, you know, you do have support there as well. So don't knock it. Don't knock it. It's really great. I know you're not knocking it. It's okay. Anyhow, we've got to come to an end of this now because we've come to the end of our half hour. I mean, that's been really interesting. And it's great having two people and not just one person because the interaction was really, really interesting. So thank you for everyone who's joined it and listened, and people who've made points on here. And thank you, David. Thank you, Elaine, for taking part, because it's been really interesting. And I'm sure we'll talk to you again and follow this through when we find, you know, whether the council is going to do something or whether they're not going to do something. And if they're not, where do we go from here? So thank you both for joining us. And it's been a great webinar.
Thank you, Francis.
And we'll end this webinar now.